Hi, this is Peter Francho, your state comptroller in Maryland. You're listening to the Conduit Street Podcast, the official podcast of the Maryland Association of Counties.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson. Michael, we are in the Conduit Street studios. It is early in the morning here on Wednesday, October 7th. How are you feeling this morning? Thanks for getting up and making the trek into the office to accommodate our schedules and record early in the morning.
Yeah, honestly, it's nice to be in town and to see you, and we've got some things going on around town today. I will say, I think this is maybe the first time we've ever recorded in the fairly early morning. And I don't know, this might lead us to be a little punchier than usual. I mean, you've got like both hands wrapped around your caffeine source, and both of us are sort of slugging through the early morning hours. Well, we'll make it, but this is a little different for us. So glad to be here.
I mean, Michael, we've all seen the headlines in recent weeks. The state revenue picture is looking very rosy, right? Everybody reads that headline and they think, hey, we're in great shape, no problem. We heard all these dire projections way back when the pandemic had first come on. Now you read the headline in every paper and everything looks great, right? I mean, is there any more to this?
$1 billion or whatever, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think it's useful for us to spend some time sort of breaking this down, right? I mean, that's kind of our lane, is to be the nerds who are willing to read past the headline has to be 6 or 8 sexy words. And so when you read this report as an enterprising journalist covering like the state government beat, it's okay, new revenues. We're writing up numbers by $1 billion and the percentages look positive and pretty good. So that's what you go with, right? That's A1 above the fold, big type. Things look great.
We led with that, right, in our weekly blog push, right?
I mean, we thought it was the biggest story of the week.
And it was.
And yeah, it was. So then sort of a lot of times you would have something like a deck below that. So then not quite as big type, but a couple sentences that give you a little narrative. And then you end up with uncertainties remain about fiscal picture and federal action. Oh, wait, hold on. That's a little more complicated than like happy days are here again. And then if you actually read the 20 paragraph article that tries to break this down, once you get to like paragraph 11, in the event that you do, you find out, wait, hold on, there's lots of ways this could go. And not all of them are happy days are here again. And we've built in some assumptions that are not ridiculous, but they're not by any means certain.
That's right. And so that leads us into today. We're going to talk about the contents of the state revenue forecast, how they got to where they are, how you got to that headline that everybody read. We'll walk through the subtext here, and we'll talk about how recent developments are certain to steer the ship moving forward. So, Michael, first of all, I mean, we've talked back in, I think, May about the dire fiscal forecast from the state's top fiscal leaders. Yeah. Things were looking bad. We know that COVID-19 pandemic had set in. All the measures to contain it, it looked like things were going to be really bad when it comes to stuff like income tax and sales tax, corporate income tax, everything like that was expected to take a huge nosedive. Here we are now in October, and at the end of the last month, we got a new forecast from the state. So let's dive into where things were, where things are now, and then how we could be affected moving forward by things that are outside of the control of the state.
Right. And I mean, as we're preparing to do that, we should make a note how unusual it is for the revenue forecasting group to get together, and even an informal, unofficial document, but to get together in the spring. I mean, this is just weeks after the General Assembly has adopted a budget and left town, to get together and say, circumstances really necessitate us coming up with some new guesses as to where we're heading. That doesn't happen, right? So that's an unusual thing unto itself. And if you're an honest broker revenue forecaster, probably the most compelling number to watch is unemployment. How many people want to work but can't find a job or are out of a job? And we saw in March and April numbers that no one in Maryland has ever seen. I mean, not even 1929 was there a week where you had people let go or suddenly out of work who are filing for unemployment benefits and so forth in the hundreds of thousands in the state. It's just, we've never seen anything like it before. So we've kind of covered that ground, but that lays the groundwork for why did they meet in May? Because everybody's hair was on fire.
Right.
And okay, so make an honest projection. What do you do if we have 12% unemployment in Maryland? What does that mean for our budget and our ability to meet the needs of our citizens?
Right. And really, I think it's just people looking to those leaders and those voices and wanting them to say something, right? So they felt like they had to get together and say something. And back in May, they projected that Maryland's general operating revenues would plummet by up to $1.1 billion for fiscal 20, which ended in June, and that we'd see a $2.6 billion deficit in fiscal 21 and nearly $4 billion in decline in fiscal 22. Those numbers now, Michael, have been revised in a big way. The state bumped up its FY21 projection by $1.4 billion and $2.1 billion for fiscal 22. So first, I think let's talk about the closeout number from fiscal 20, because we have those actuals now. We can see exactly what happened. You can dive into that report.
Yeah.
What happened? What have we seen? What has worked to keep these numbers from plummeting the way we thought they might in May?
So I think this is probably the proper way to sort of telescope this is, when you're back in May and forecasting out a year or two at the beginning of a completely uncertain pandemic, which we don't know what the health consequence or the fiscal consequence are going to be.
Right.
There's like massive uncertainty. I keep using this analogy of the hurricane map when, there's like a tropical storm and it's like a grade 1 or grade 2 and it's out in the Atlantic Ocean. And then they come up with these cool maps and they say, where is it going to land on the East Coast? And you see this big map that goes like all the way up to like Nantucket and then it's down to Miami.
Right.
And when it's early, it's a huge, huge range of possible landing spots.
Right, you have that cone, right?
Yeah, right. And then as things get closer and as things get clearer, then we say, okay, it's probably North or South Carolina. Mm-hmm. So you're safe up here in Delaware and Maryland. You're safe in South Florida. You're probably safe in Alabama. But this is going to land in North Carolina, South Carolina. We've got the smaller cone, right? Mm-hmm. So think of revenue forecasting the same way. The farther you look out, the more uncertainty there is. So this is good. Let's start with, we now have last fiscal year in the books. Once you get to June 30 and, you sort of tie up the accounting over the space of a few weeks afterwards, we know where last fiscal year ended. So we start there and then let's move forward from there. But the closeout for fiscal 20, as of last June 30, not that bad, right?
Right. So the adjustment in May proved to be far too conservative, to the tune of about $924 million for fiscal 20. So they projected huge losses. It didn't turn out that way. And what we saw, Michael, was personal and corporate income tax revenue exceeded expectations, actually. Sales tax came in lower than expected. I think that is also something that we could expect. But when it comes to personal income tax, it actually grew by 4.2% over 2019. That was unexpected. What are your thoughts? What are you seeing there as to why that may have happened?
So, first of all, personal income is the single most important foundation for what's happening in today's economy and as a basis to generate state government revenue.
Right.
The income tax on us as individuals, not corporations, we can get to that too, but the income tax on us as individuals is number one and by a pretty wide margin over all the rest. So it's the single most important thing. How much are we out there earning through our paychecks, earning through investments and capital gains and so forth? But like week to week, those of us who have a paycheck and have it withheld every week and so forth, that's the number one thing to move the needle. And it's a function of today's economy. So back to unemployment for the moment. You make a good faith estimate when you're seeing these giant waves of newly unemployed Marylanders thinking those are folks who are not going to have a paycheck.
Right.
So they're not going to be withholding income tax. And what they end up paying for the months of April, May, and June is going to drop. Like maybe in the aggregate, maybe that's going to drop 15, 20, 25, 30%, numbers you just don't see.
Right, right.
So I think it's a reasonable, good faith place to be on May 1st to say this could really go over the cliff with a wide cone of uncertainty. It seems like what we saw was a lot of people who became newly unemployed found themselves supported by the federal government. We know unemployment insurance is meant to be a safety net for people who are without a job. The federal government put extra weight into unemployment insurance benefits, and that's taxable income.
Right. That's the big takeaway, that the federal stimulus funds worked as they were intended to work. This includes direct payments to eligible Marylanders, those $1,200 stimulus checks, which were on a sliding scale, but that pumped money into the economy very quickly.
And that happened in the fiscal year we're talking about.
Exactly.
So you get a check from the federal government, with a big signature on it for $1,200, and that happens to you during fiscal 20. So the year we're closing out, we didn't know the feds were going to come up with this relief package. They did for quite a lot of Americans, plus the unemployed.
Right. And then you, of course, have the Paycheck Protection Program that helped businesses. And that extra bump in $600 federal unemployment benefits that has since expired. But that really did work, and it prevented a catastrophic economic crash. So I think you mentioned it earlier. When you're trying to run these numbers and look at the unemployment numbers, you can't think anything else but this is going to be really, really bad to the likes of we've never seen this before. But then the federal government steps in. They provide this safety net. We often, bash the feds on this podcast, but in this instance, they actually did their job and they kept the economy from crashing. Now, moving forward, we don't know what that will look like, but at least for fiscal 20, I think that really buoyed our economy and really helped to actually grow income tax revenue over 2019.
Right. And I think the reason why we might say that that's their job is by the structure of the way we've built levels of government, the federal government has a different sort of elasticity. Their ability to react to a crisis like this is way different and way stronger than a state or a county.
Right.
So a state has a balanced budget requirement. They can't just go out and borrow $3 billion, float some bonds or whatever, borrow a bunch of money and spend at a deficit for a few years to get through a tough time. The state can't do that. County governments can't do that. The federal government can. Now, independent of what you think about deficit spending and the way the federal government has operated for basically our lifetimes, as a practical matter, they can do precisely that. They can go out and say, we're going to borrow $1 billion, or excuse me, for them, they're in the T's, right? $1 trillion or $2 to keep things from falling off the cliff. It has happened before on a certain scale with the TARP program at the fiscal crisis, a decade or so ago. And we saw basically the same kind of thing. Let's rally the troops. Metaphorically, let's get all the votes we can for a package to help Americans and businesses and keep this from being a collapse. And I think an awful lot of people, myself included, would say appropriate, reasonable thing to do.
Right. And, personal income tax, of course, does matter for counties here in Maryland. We levy a personal income tax at the local level. So income tax growth is good news for counties. Michael, let's get into the next layer here. And when you're forecasting revenues and you're thinking about how people are going to react, taxpayer behavior, a lot of this has to do with the markets, right?
Yeah, I mean, so if the biggest mover in income tax and personal income is people with jobs getting a paycheck and being withheld, now we've got this extra horse in the race, which is people without jobs who are getting an unemployment check that has an extra tier of federal assistance on top. So instead of them getting a fraction of their former salary, now they're actually being held intact more or less, or in some cases they may be a little better off. But okay, so those are important. We also look at what's going to happen with unearned income. And that's things like capital gains. The simplest thing is people who are invested in the stock market and have those kinds of assets. We tend to think of in a good year on the stock market, people are going to take some gains, pull some money out of the market, cash them in and pay on the capital gains.
Right.
So those are good years for that unearned revenue. So in a typical recession, in a typical crisis economy, the stock market is terrible. Right. And we saw that briefly in the spring when suddenly there's a big spike in unemployment, the stock market falls apart for the space of a couple of weeks, and no one knew quite what to do. But since then, in part because of federal relief right to companies, and maybe because of the checks going out to individuals saying, keep buying shoes, keep buying, takeout meals and that sort of stuff. Let's keep the economy going. We haven't seen the private sector. We haven't seen most of America's businesses and publicly traded companies fall apart. Stock market has come largely back. And so if you're projecting that part of income tax, not so bad.
Right.
Like, you're not making the predictions that you usually do in a crisis economy, which would be no one's got capital gains this year. It's a terrible year.
And capital gains are notoriously difficult.
Yeah, they're
to
fickle.
project,
Yeah, they're fickle anyway. It's the hardest thing to project anyhow. But to the extent that you're saying in good times project a good number and in bad times project a small number, now you're in a weird spot because objectively these seem like bad times for the economy, but they're not bad times for corporate America right now.
Right. Corporate profitability has actually been okay. In Maryland, the corporate income tax revenues grew 1.8% over fiscal 2019. Sales tax, Michael, this is to be expected. I think we saw a decline of 3.7% from 2019. This is interesting because let's remind our listeners how sales tax works in Maryland. We don't assess the sales tax to certain items, right? And amid this pandemic, I think if you thought a lot of people are going to go out and they're going to buy medicine and they're going to buy food, everybody's going to be at home. We don't tax those things, right? So you'd have to think that's going to take a hit. Nobody's out there, as you always like to say, buying refrigerators, right, amid this pandemic. So what are you seeing here?
I don't think anyone knows exactly. So this is, neither you nor I are really, frontline revenue collectors and economists and so forth. We're just, playing one on TV. But to the extent that I want to try and I stayed at that hotel chain, so I'm an expert now. How about this? Spending has come down a bit. People feel more uncertain about their future, so you may not want to commit to a big ticket thing. If you're not sure your job is going to come back, for all these people who are laid off, but you're still getting an unemployment check, you probably don't feel like, hey, this is great and it's going to last forever. So I'm going to go out and spend like crazy and get that big new video game console that I've always wanted. Or actually, people are buying the video game consoles because they're at home.
Turns out they are.
Yeah. Right? but some of the durable goods is the term of art. People aren't necessarily doing a ton of that. And I don't know. I can't remember the last time I bought an article of clothing other than sweatpants, right?
That's all you need, right? That's all you need.
Yeah. So I don't know. A lot of routine buying has probably slowed down. And so that's why you would see a drop by the end of fiscal 20. So we're talking about into the spring and the early summer months of this year, sales tax being down a bit. A 3 or 4% drop's a pretty big deal.
Right.
Ordinarily, in an ordinary economy, you'd see that bump up by 2, 3, 4% in a given year.
And I think we were on track to get there before the pandemic.
Right. So that's almost certainly pandemic effects. But as we get into forecasting ahead, there's another weird thing going on, and that is people don't know where to put their money right now. If you're spooked by the stock market and the bond market is weird and tricky and so forth, interest rates have turned super low. And we know that a lot of people buying a house, if you're in a situation where you feel like you might be able to afford a house and make that commitment, if you think your job is secure and you can do that, interest rates are super low right now. And if you're thinking in terms of a monthly payment, houses are on sale.
Right. And a lot of people refinancing as well.
Yes. Yeah. So there's plenty of that. But one thing that happens is people typically, when they buy a house, they put stuff in it.
That's right.
So they do buy a new sink and they buy a new fridge and a washing machine or an area rug or a piece of furniture and all those sorts of things. Whether you, even if you buy online, we have the sales and use tax technically is it applies to stuff brought into the state. So you put all those pieces together and things might be kind of artificially inflated on the sales tax side because people are spending on stuff that go along with buying a new house. You don't pay sales tax on a house. That's a different thing. But the stuff you put into a house is a pretty meaningful part of what generates sales tax.
I think that's a great point. Including big ticket items like appliances, right? So you got to put appliances in the house. So, look, we've gone through where the state is, what happened in fiscal 20. We've talked about why and what the state has done in terms of projections moving forward. And Michael, we know that these projections come with a few major caveats. And first, the projections, the revenue uptick is assuming that Congress is going to pump out another round of significant stimulus, not only for the state and local governments, but for residents, for businesses. And it also assumes that we're not going to see a second wave of COVID-19 infections, which would result in shutting down the economy again. So these are really big ifs, right, moving forward. And I think all of this essentially amounts to revenue forecasting is really hard. And yes, these numbers were off. But again, you can't predict what the federal government is going to do, that they're going to pump all this money in, that it's going to work. You can't predict that the interest rates are going to plummet. Like you said, people are buying homes, they're putting stuff in their homes. So all in all, I mean, it's really difficult. And even so, we've seen this revenue write-up. If you're down in the 24th paragraph, that's where you're going to see these caveats and that, hey, don't go out and spend gangbusters because we have to make these assumptions and they are major, major ifs moving forward.
Yeah. And if you're the type of person, which Kevin, you and I are, that you're the type of person who actually would read the full report from the Board of Revenue Estimates and the Bureau that channels them, you get into the weeds in that report and you see pages that are labeled things like scenario A, scenario B, scenario C and D. And these are like, okay, well, but what if this happens and what if that happens and then what happens from here? And those typically these are just like big graphs and stuff like that, but like those graphs will look quite different when you change a couple of those base assumptions.
Right.
So, if the feds don't come through with a wave 2 of support, then, we have to rewrite everything. And if we have a serious and deleterious second wave of COVID that requires, aggressive measures that would affect the economy, that affects the numbers a lot also. Mm-hmm. And that's stuff kind of, it's beyond the economist realm exactly, but you have to say, like, we're making our guesses based on the things we see and we predict. And you work with a company like Moody's. Mm-hmm. The state has a contract with Moody's and their forecasting service, and they've done basically the same thing. Like, we think this is what's going to happen politically and medically, and based on that, here's what we think goes with that economically. But yeah, revenue forecasting is hard. We've been in the room and heard the forecaster guy basically say, I know I'm going to be wrong. I just don't yet know in what direction and for what reasons.
Right. And that's a perfect place to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about those scenarios and what could happen moving forward, including how recent developments may and almost certainly will impact these forecasts moving forward. All that and more after the break.
This is John Frenay with Ion Annapolis to let you know about our daily news brief podcast. If you want to keep up on Annapolis area local news, local weather, and local events, check us out. We produce episodes every Monday through Friday at 7 a.m. and deliver them right to your phone or computer for free. You can also catch them on our Facebook page, All Annapolis, or under the podcast category at eyeonannapolis.net. You can even ask Alexa to play it for you. So, if you want to keep up to speed on Mayor Buckley, County Executive Pittman, Navy football, maybe you're looking for a weekend thing to do, or if you just want to catch the hyper-local weather, give a listen to the Ion Annapolis Daily News Brief. We'll see you tomorrow morning.
Welcome back to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally back here with Michael Sanderson. Michael, on the front half, we talked about the state's revenue projections. We talked about what the actual numbers looked like for fiscal 20. We have that data. We can read the reports and dive in. We also know, though, that things are looking rosier for fiscal 21, fiscal 22, the out years, right? The state has written up those projections. It's rosier, right? But we still have these caveats that we talked about on the front end. So, all of this is dependent on things that we're seeing in Washington, things that, like vaccines, right? All of these things that are big unknowns at this point. So when you look at the projections now we've written up for 21 and 22, what is your take? I mean, is it the same thing? Like, hey, revenue forecasting is hard and there are a lot of unknowns?
Definitely true that forecasting is hard, but I would say, like, to pick up on where we left off in the front half, I would say, like, what a weird time it's got to be to be an economist who focuses on the public sector. Whether you work for Moody's or whether you work for the state of Maryland or wherever, you have a degree in econometrics, and you're really, really good at sifting through financial information, and you read all this stuff we've talked about is like the underlying the things that drive the numbers. We watch the unemployment, we watch those weekly claims numbers, we try and understand what's embedded in there, how many people have left the labor force. Like the language of economists has become sort of the currency of talking about this kind of stuff.
We look at baskets of goods.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right. All those sorts of phrases that, we're not practicing economists, but when you hang out with them, you need to understand the things that they pay attention to. Mm-hmm. Right. And like dopes like us spend our time paying attention to things like Twitter and social media and chit chat and politics and hashtags. Right. So now if you're the revenue forecaster for the state of Maryland, the tables have turned. Like you know what you got to go get a Twitter account, dude. If you're doing forecasting for the state of Maryland, you've got to be on Twitter, because probably the biggest variables that affect how things look are what are the momentary adjustments in vaccine trials? Like what's the word on the street about the stage 3 for this company's vaccine? And that, like, is that happening? Does that look like it's going to happen by New Year's Eve, or is it going to be next Easter or whatever? I mean, and then at the same time, to be honest, like the politics in Washington are an enormous part of this. We made general mention that the presence of a second round of federal relief is kind of baked into these forecasts. So, okay, that's not a dishonest thing for Moody's and for the state of Maryland to do, but that's a really, really big deal. And the news is happening not in economics reports, but it's happening like in real time in social media, right?
It really is. And it's important, I think. I mean, look, we sit here and we talk about Twitter, and yes, Twitter is certainly where the action is. We have all these scoops that are constantly populating to your feed. I mean, I feel bad that we're asking people to log into Twitter, because if you are a prolific Twitter user like you and I are, the past week particularly has been exhausting. It's just nonstop. And now Eddie Van Halen is dead. Right. I mean, 2020 can't get any worse.
It's hard to imagine. Although, I mean, I don't know. Did we just skip the murder hornets? Did that just not happen? Did they just take they did like the cicada thing? Like, we'll come back. We'll do another time.
Yeah, you know what? This is too much. Right. And we don't think you can handle it right now. But honestly, though, it is exhausting, and it is nonstop news, and it's crazy. So, case in point, yesterday, speaking of stimulus, and again, we mentioned that these projections that Maryland's revenue forecasters are making are based on the assumption that we will get another round of significant federal stimulus.
And for the week or so since the formal meeting of our state revenue forecast, we saw day-by-day stuff happening through social media mostly, saying that we're still negotiating in the House. The House of Representatives might have a new package. They're talking directly with Secretary Mnuchin, and he's trying to leverage a deal that might get support in the U.S. Senate. Mm-hmm. I mean, those are the hurdles you would need to clear to get something done. And we always thought this might be a process of it won't be the whole plan that the House liked, but it might be more than the Senate had once talked about. So maybe there's a middle ground. And I don't know, if you're trying to read these tea leaves, there was reason last Thursday, Friday, and over the weekend to have some degree of optimism. Something might happen.
Yeah, we saw the Problem Solvers Caucus get involved, and everybody was trying to work out some kind of a deal that would pump money into the economy and help people that need it.
Right. And then we know, the news cycle over the weekend was different and focused on other things that may or may not have had anything to do with the political back and forth. But then Tuesday night happens. And actually Tuesday afternoon, the president sends a tweet that he is cutting off negotiations for a new round of federal stimulus until after the election. Michael, right away, the markets tumbled. And again, this is like at 3 o'clock or somewhere. Yeah, and
it's an amazing time that one tweet can drive so much policy, can crash the markets. I mean, really, these are wild times. But after that tweet went out, you and I were watching Twitter. We saw other tweets later on from the president that sort of walked back his initial remarks. And he's talking now about, well, maybe I will do some of this stuff. Like, I like the idea of sending the stimulus checks to everybody. I like the idea of maybe bailing out the airline industry. I want to get money to these businesses to keep propping them up. But I don't like all the other stuff. So I'd like to do this piecemeal. And if you send that to me now, I'll sign it.
It's as a tribute to Eddie and his friends. It's a little bit like going through the bowl of M&Ms and picking out the colors that you want and the colors that you don't want, right? Like we don't want the brown M&Ms. Get them out of here. That's in the contract,
right? And we know the danger in that, right? I mean, we're the county podcast. We have been pushing NACo at the national level, has been pushing for direct and flexible aid to states and local governments who we know are on the front lines of the pandemic. The danger of doing this piecemeal is the stuff that you don't do now gets kicked down the road and then you never do it. Potentially, right? So if you're talking about, well, I'll do this stuff piecemeal now, the danger in that is the other stuff never gets done. And so now you're in a situation where you have this stalemate between Congress and the president, and it's all political at this point. You know, they're trying to back each other into a corner. And what does that mean moving forward? Particularly, let's bring it back to our revenue forecast.
Right. So like we're all guessing. I mean, we're literally like the markets just opened as we've been recording, so I don't even know what happens. But the fact that U.S. markets tumbled on the president's announcement that he's walking away from the table strongly suggests that most of the people who are guiding money for investments were thinking they're going to work something out. And if the president announces, I'm walking away from the table, that seems like a big development. I'm more pessimistic. That's uncertainty. That's downside risk. And maybe I want to get out. I have no idea what today, Wednesday, is going to be looking like. If you typically listen to this podcast on Friday and Saturday, like a lot of people seem to, who knows? Like the market may be way down, or I mean, all those indicators are crazy. And if we knew how that was going to happen, we wouldn't be stuck here doing this podcast. We would be like moving a lot of Quip toothbrushes and a lot of purple mattresses and so forth with our we know the market podcast. So someday maybe that'll be our gig. But for now, we should stay in our lane and say everybody who watches this stuff has their head in their hands trying to figure out what the heck could possibly be going on. But certainly a big nod in the direction of uncertainty and maybe nothing happening.
Now, the president said initially negotiations are off until after the election. So let's walk through a couple scenarios here. The first scenario is that they get something done before the election, right? And then the second one would be during the lame duck term in Congress. And then, of course, you can go out post January 20th. How would all of that affect Maryland's revenue projections when it comes to what we're looking at, let's say, for fiscal 21? Do these dates matter?
I think the dates definitely matter. And especially to the extent that anecdotally in Maryland and across the country, we think that there's an awful lot of people who got some temporary help through extra unemployment benefits. Those don't exist anymore, and those people are now getting by on a fraction of their former income.
And we've also seen, the comptroller, they've projected that half of the jobs that we lost will not come back.
Right. So that's a huge unknown. Is a lot of the jobs in just in the what we'd think economically as a short term, like the next 12 months or so. Like if you're working at a hotel, if you were working at a restaurant, in hospitality, in some of the service areas that were most immediately and abruptly hit, like a lot of those jobs aren't back. Your bar and restaurant might be open, but it's just a third capacity. It's only at certain times and only on nice days. That's kind of what's happening now.
Right.
So the staff has not been all brought back. If you had 18 people on staff at that restaurant before, you're getting by with 8, and those jobs just don't exist now. It's not a matter of we're rehiring for the night shift. It's not like that. So all those things, like if we go an extra 6 weeks or an extra 3 months in that setting, and I mean, sorry, but as we think about restaurants and outdoor seating, that's been the parachute for a lot of the economy, it's going to get cold come November, December, and sitting outside and having your enchiladas is going to feel a little less inviting when it's 26 degrees. I mean, I'm going to still be wearing shorts. I'm committed to short pants through the calendar year.
Oh, me too. But I will say, though, the good news is we've seen counties in Maryland stepping up with innovative programs to provide grants to restaurants who are winterizing their operations and making sure that they can have patio seating with heaters and whatnot, because it seems like that is the only way they can survive throughout the winter. If you can't have people inside because of social distancing and whatnot, and you really have to have access to that outdoor seating. So counties are stepping up with a lot of these innovative ideas. But I agree with you. I mean, 6 weeks a week makes a big difference when it comes to what the revenue picture looks like for the state.
So I think that's definitely the case. So it really matters. And if it's just, we're not even going to talk about this stuff until into the month of November. And for Congress, that typically means really into the month of December. It's usually the month of December where a lame duck Congress gets a lot of stuff done that had been on the to-do list for their 2-year term. That's a really common phenomenon, and there's no reason to not think that might happen here. Anyway, what we're getting at is, like, if instead of this happening in October, it might be December, that itself is a big deal to the American and Maryland economy and our revenue. I think if there's that much uncertainty, and whether we're getting our news through social media or conventional channels or whatever, if we go over the next couple of weeks and it looks like nothing's happening now, who knows what might happen in December or in January or whenever, it's probably time to leaf back into those reports, and instead of going with, our official projection is based on the feds coming through. Right. It's probably time to look at scenario B and C and D and whatever else is out there. But let's look at some of those not so rosy, not so optimistic, and no big uptick. It's probably time to dust off scenario C and D.
Which is bad.
Yeah. So, if you're a policymaker, you're used to just watching the revenue forecast and having a pretty clear idea. Like, this is going to be a tough year, or this is going to be a relatively smooth year. I don't think you have that forecast. There's still a pretty wide cone on where the storm could land, so to speak.
And of course, the election and how the election turns out is going to have a major impact on what happens moving forward. When we can develop a vaccine and get it out to people has a big impact here. So a lot of unknowns, but that's where we are right now. Michael, do you have any closing thoughts about revenue projections or the state's fiscal picture moving forward? Maybe how it's going to affect county governments? I mean, if this plays out the way they think it does?
Well, I guess, a couple minutes on what the feds are talking about. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit. We had Mark Ritacco from MACo join us a few weeks ago, and I thought he did a nice job of walking through the components of what a round 2, or you could call it round 4 or 5 or whatever. It's hard to keep count, but a next big round of federal stimulus or recovery or support or whatever. The next round would include a bunch of different pieces. We think there's a really strong argument that state and local governments need basically help us replace revenues we're going to lose, so we don't have to lay off the people who are doing this frontline work.
Right.
I think that's a compelling argument. It's gotten tied up in politics, and that's one of the items that you don't see as a presidential olive branch.
Right, it's not on his short list.
Right. So if his short list is, hey, checks to people, I could get on board with doing that real quick, probably especially if it got out before the election. Maybe we could do something for unemployed people. Okay, maybe that's an area of some possible common ground. Maybe let's rescue some airlines, because we don't want that to just, that's an infrastructure we don't want to disappear. Okay, like, those are the sorts of things we've seen as maybe that's the quick middle ground. Instead of being supportive on this area, we've seen the language from the president be negative. And he's seemingly persuaded by some anecdotes that, there's going to be some state that's run by the other political party that's made bad decisions, and they're going to use COVID money to sort of paper over their fiscal problems. They have their pension system is broke, and they're going to somehow hijack this money and fill up their pension program, or things like that are un-COVID related. I mean, I think universally the leaders in state and local governments at the Governors Association and NACo and the League of Cities and so forth have all said, like, we'll take strings.
Right.
If the feds want to show up and say, this is just, to replace the revenues you're losing because of the economy, to target areas of spending that have been triggered by having this pandemic, we'll take those kind of strings. Just get the money out so we don't have to fall apart.
Right.
Regardless, there's some political messaging at work, and that is just part of what happens when it's Washington politics in making the final call. Is it's going to get fraught with stuff on Twitter and who's winning the optics war and things like that. So sadly, a little less about governance and a little more about, sort of politicking. That's what we get in the nation's capital.
Tough times, a lot of unknowns. I think the big takeaway is everybody should go download the Twitter app. It is free for some reason.
I don't know. I would feel guilty telling people to do that. Like if there were just, I don't know, maybe there's a service out there. Maybe this is the $1 million idea, like a service out there that someone could read through what might have been your Twitter feed and like give me a morning, download. I don't know. Maybe John Frenaye could be this, like our guy John could be very capable of saying, if you stayed away from social media yesterday, like a few minutes on the Eye on Annapolis, I actually, like, we should talk to John.
Yeah, shout out to the Eye on Annapolis podcast.
I'd listen to John tell me what I missed on social media every day.
I like it. Maybe we could do that.
Maybe. I don't know. Maybe it's our lane. I don't know. We could do it together.
Yeah, we could do it together. Side project. All right. We'll leave it there for today. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and of course, the Conduit Street blog. But for now, for Michael, this is Kevin signing off, and we will talk to you soon.